Police raid a cartel safehouse at 3 a.m., expecting guns and cash. Instead, their flashlights hit an altar, candles everywhere, a skeleton bride in a glass case, a man with a mustache and a white shirt, bullets and pesos laid out like offerings. That is Santa Muerte and Jesus Malverde sharing the same table with the cartels, and it raises a simple question: why do drug lords pray before a job instead of after it? From a kidnapper nicknamed El Mocaorejas to bosses in the Gulf Cartel, from Mexico City gang leaders like El Lunares to a Malverde statue that mysteriously appeared around El Chapo's trial, tonight we are diving into the saints of the narco world. Still, we are going to do it with receipts. What the scholarship says, what the novels and corridos show, and what the people living in these neighborhoods say these saints really do. I am Arturo, and this is Latin Lora. From Latin American history to mysteries and true crime, from local legends to the archives they leave behind, every story here gets checked before it reaches your headphones. Tonight, we are not looking at these saints through a U.S. law enforcement PowerPoint. We are looking from here, from Latin America, from the streets and deserts where people live between bullets and borders every day. Let's start with the skeleton in the room, Nuestra Señora de la Santa Muerte. You have probably seen her somewhere online, a female Grim Reaper, a robed skeleton holding a scythe and sometimes a globe or scale. Her shrines show up in the rough barrios of Mexico City, in Oaxaca markets, in Los Angeles botanicas, and along migrant trails. One historian of religion describes her as the fastest growing new devotion in the Americas. Millions of devotees, candles, rosaries, and statues in every color. White for cleansing and gratitude, gold for money, green for legal problems, red for love or passion. Black for full protection, and some believe for revenge. For a street vendor or a taxi driver facing armed robbery every week, for a sex worker on the night shift, for a migrant about to climb into a hidden compartment or cross the desert, Santa Muerte is a kind of spiritual bodyguard. You light the candle, leave the cigarette, pour the tequila, and ask her to send you back alive. Anthropologist Kate Kingsbury's fieldwork shows that a huge number of her devotees are poor women and indigenous or Afro-Mexican mothers, the people the state almost always forgets first. They believe the skeleton saint understands unsafe relationships, hunger, bad bosses, femicide, and the fear of seeing your daughter disappear in a country where too often there is no investigation. For them, she is not the narco's girlfriend. She is a mother who does not flinch when the problem is ugly. But there is also the side that turns her into headline material. When Mexican police arrested the kidnapper Daniel Arizmendi Lopez, better known as El Mocaorejas, for his habit of mutilating hostages, they found that he kept a Santa Muerte altar and even managed to bring an image of the saint inside prison. When the Gulf Cartel boss Gilberto García Mena El June was captured at his ranch in Tamaulipas, investigators displayed his altars, Santa Muerte statues surrounded by liquor, cash, and photos. A whole room turned into a private chapel. U.S. and Mexican authorities have found her shrines in stash houses on both sides of the border, next to bales of drugs and ledgers listing human beings as cargo. In one famous case in Sonora, a tiny fringe group carried out ritual killings in her name, something closer to a cult than to the everyday Santa Muerte devotion you see on the street, but enough to burn the phrase death cult into the media's vocabulary. If you walked into a house and saw an altar with a hooded skeleton, guns, stacks of cash, and candles all around, would you feel protected or hunted? Be honest. The easy explanation is to say criminals worship dark things, and that is why they do dark things. But the researchers who have spent time at these shrines say the cause and effect is more complicated. Most devotees are not narcos at all. They are people living in a constant low-level emergency. And an amoral saint, not immoral, but amoral, who listens without asking for your police record or your church attendance becomes attractive. When you are already outside the law, or simply outside respectability, an outlaw saint looks closer than a saint of marble in a cathedral. Now cross the country in your head to Sinaloa to Culiacan, capital of the Sinaloa cartel mythos. A few blocks from government buildings, you find a low chapel full of green paint and white tile. Inside, behind bulletproof glass, there is no skeleton, just a bust of a man with a part in his hair and a mustache. Jesus Malverde. According to legend, Malverde was a construction worker or railroad hand in the late 1800s who turned to banditry after his parents died of poverty. In the years when Porfirian modernization brought mines, railways, and big sugar estates to Sinaloa, he supposedly robbed rich landowners and mining shipments. He shared part of the loot with people with low incomes. Eventually, the authorities caught him, or he was betrayed, hanged, or shot, and left exposed as a warning. People from nearby villages are said to have started throwing stones over the place where his body lay, each stone a petition. That anonymous pile grows into a kind of outlaw shrine. Whether or not there was a historical Jesus Malverde, exactly like the legend, scholars of Mexican folk religion and popular culture agree that he fits into a tradition of social bandits. These figures break the law but are remembered as protectors of the community against arrogant elites. In the Malverde Chapel today, the walls are covered with plaques. Thank you for saving my daughter from surgery, for bringing my husband back from the United States, for getting me out of prison. You see bricklayers, market vendors, undocumented migrants, and taxi drivers in those photos. It is not a private cartel clubhouse. It is a public people's church. One geographer who studied the shrine points out that Malverde became a way for poor Sinaloans to talk back to modernization, while foreign mining companies and big landowners extracted wealth with the blessing of Mexico City. A bandit saint who robs the rich and protects the poor becomes a kind of folk editorial. We know who is really stealing here, and it is not just the guy with the gun in the canyon. In the late 20th century, as Sinaloa turned into a global hub for opium, marijuana, and later cocaine routes, that image was recycled. Now it was not a silver convoy being ambushed, but a truck full of drugs bound for the U.S. Narco bosses began funding Malverde chapels, donating money for renovations, and sponsoring his feast day on May 3rd with food and banda music. By kneeling before the bust and leaving thick envelopes of cash, they could present themselves as heirs to a Robin Hood tradition, even if the reality on the ground was closer to a low-intensity civil war. And yet the stories people tell about Malverde always hover between crime and morality. In novels like La Maldición de Malverde, writers describe a fictional kingpin, Don Marcelo, who prays to Malverde not for more money, but to survive long enough to provide for his people and to find hope and happiness in a war on drugs that eats his own family. He begs Malverde to make him invisible to enemies, to protect his town from an endless spiral of raids, corruption, and revenge. The saint in those pages is not a clean Catholic icon. He is more like an older cousin, not divine, but a little closer to the mess. Someone who understands what it is to live half in the shadows. Narco corridos take that feeling and put it into first person. Singers talk to Malverde directly. Do not leave me alone at the checkpoint. Let this load pass. Let me see my family again. The macho voice of the brave narco hides a particular fear, premature death. One researcher calls this an alternative religiosity against premature death. The saint is less a ticket to heaven than a supernatural seatbelt when you drive at 200 kilometers per hour with the police and rival gangs behind you. If you grew up in a town where the only new school, the only paved road, the only clinic with medicine was built with money from someone in that business, and that someone had a big Malverde picture in his office, would you see the saint as evil or as a necessary ally? And there is more. The cult of Malverde is not confined to Culiacan. Migrants have carried him north. There are Malverde candles and small shrines along routes into Arizona and Texas. His busts are in U.S. botanicas. His image appears in popular culture, even in a Breaking Bad episode where a DEA agent keeps a Malverde bust on his desk. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration once displayed one of its seized statues as a teaching prop in its own museum. The people's saint has entered the global market, literally. Then comes the moment that made headlines. During one phase of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's trial in New York, a small Malverde statue reportedly appeared in a conference room used by his defense team. Nobody wants to say who put it there, but it fits the pattern. Somewhere in that circle, someone wanted the bandit saint of Sinaloa present in the middle of the most famous drug trial of our time, maybe as a joke, maybe as a genuine plea for a miracle. In Mexico City, in the barrio of Tepito, police have raided properties linked to the group known as La Unión. In some of those houses, investigators found altars that mix Santa Muerte and Malverde images with Afro-Cuban objects, guns, cash, drugs, and, in a particularly chilling case, dozens of human bones. One of the group's alleged leaders, Oscar El Lunares, was described in the press as a believer in Malverde and a practitioner of magic who relied on saints and spells for protection. At the same time, his organization was linked to extortion, drug dealing, and multiple homicides. The altar becomes a crime scene photo. The saint becomes an exhibit. It is easy to look at those images and think, it is the saint that corrupts the people. But remember the other side. A woman lighting a Santa Muerte candle in a rented room so her son will not be shot by a stray bullet on his way back from the night shift. A man in Sinaloa leaving a small plaque for Malverde because, after years of undocumented work, he finally managed to return from California alive. A trans sex worker in Oaxaca whispering to a Santa Muerte statue tucked in the corner of a crowded market, asking not for wealth or revenge, but for one more night without a violent client. The same icons, radically different moral universes. That is why scholars talk about the polarization in how these figures are received. On one side, officials and mainstream churches see in Santa Muerte and Malverde a threat to order, a superstition that gets in the way of progress, a convenient symbol to attach to the brutality of the narco world. On the other hand, devotees who see in them a way to make sense of injustice, to talk back to a modernity that has left entire regions disposable. When bishops say that it has nothing to do with our Catholic religion, many devotees answer, Malverde always helped the poor. He was by their side. Here, the bishop only goes to the rich people's houses for breakfast. That line from a play about Malverde captures the clash perfectly. Institutional religion on one side, folk religion of those left out on the other. So, where does that leave us? On the one hand, ignoring the criminal side of these devotions would be dishonest. There really are bosses like El June who pray in front of skeletons and bandit saints before shipments leave the ranch. There really are kidnappers like El Mocorejas who keep Santa Muerte beside their bed and in their cells. There really are stash houses with altars where human beings are treated like packages. And there really was that fringe group in Sonora that used Santa Muerte as a pretext for horrific acts. On the other hand, blaming these saints for violence can be a way of avoiding harder questions about the economy, politics, and history. It is easier to say there is a cult ruining the youth than to say our model of development has produced entire zones where the main careers are migration, informal trade, and organized crime, and where the state shows up mainly as soldiers and police. In those zones, official saints often look far away, and the saints of the street, death herself, a bandit who never existed in official records, feel closer. So here is my reveal. The phrase narco saints sounds cool in a title, and yes, some traffickers do treat Santa Muerte and Malverde like supernatural business partners. But if you only see them as evil mascots, you miss their other role as mirrors. They reflect a Latin America where for millions of people, the main question is not how to be saved in the next world, but how to survive this week. That is why death, which takes rich and poor alike, becomes a saint. That is why a bandit from the Sierra becomes an angel of people with low incomes. And that is why their altars keep multiplying even as authorities try to demolish them. So I want to throw this back to you. If you saw a Santa Muerte or Malverde tattoo on someone next to you on the bus tonight, what would you think first? Criminal, survivor, or something in between? Should the presence of these images be treated as a red flag? Or is that just another way of criminalizing the same neighborhoods the state has already abandoned? If tonight's journey into narco saints made you look twice at a news headline or a Netflix series, do the usual Latin Laura ritual. Hit like, share this episode with that friend who loves dark religion and cartel stories. Because somewhere out there, on the edge of a highway or behind a market stall, there is another little altar glowing in the dark, half fear, half hope, and as long as people keep asking those saints for a way to dodge premature death, we will keep coming back here in our own voice to ask what that says about the world that built them. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.